Hashtag an emotional scene as William and Catherine listened to King Charles's cancer speech. Hashtag part 1. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the polished floors of the private sitting room. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, sat quietly on the edge of an antique sofa, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though the slight tremor in her fingers betrayed the calm facade she was trying to maintain. Across from her, William paced slowly by the window, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of worry that he rarely allowed others to see. The room, normally filled with the comfortable sounds of family life, was unusually quiet. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, their voices notably absent from the corridors where they would typically be heard playing or discussing their school lessons. It was one of those rare moments when the weight of royal duty intersected with the raw vulnerability of being human, creating a tension that hung in the air like an unspoken prayer. Catherine's phone buzzed softly on the coffee table beside her, but she made no move to check it. The world outside continued its relentless pace, unaware that inside these walls, two people who had dedicated their lives to public service were about to face one of the most challenging moments of their personal journey. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that they, who spent their days comforting others and representing hope and stability for millions, were now the ones in need of comfort. William finally stopped pacing and turned to face his wife. Their eyes met across the room, and in that silent exchange, years of shared experiences, mutual support, and deep understanding passed between them. They had weathered many storms together since their university days at St. Andrews, but this felt different. This wasn't about public scrutiny, royal protocol, or media pressure. This was about family, about mortality, about the man who had raised William and who had become a beloved father figure to Catherine. The television screen in the corner of the room displayed the BBC logo, waiting for the scheduled broadcast that would change everything. Palace staff had been unusually subdued that morning, their typical efficiency tinged with an undercurrent of concern. Even the most senior advisors, who had seen decades of royal announcements, seemed to move with extra care, as if afraid that sudden movements might shatter the fragile atmosphere that had settled over the royal household. Catherine rose from the sofa and moved to stand beside William at the window. Together, they looked out at the carefully maintained gardens, where early spring flowers were just beginning to show signs of life after the long winter. The metaphor wasn't lost on either of them. Life, resilience, renewal, these were concepts they understood both intellectually and emotionally, but today they felt more personal than ever. "He wanted to tell us himself first," William said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a conversation they had shared with his father just hours earlier. The private phone call had been brief, but profound, filled with the kind of honesty that comes only in moments of crisis. King Charles, always one to shoulder burdens alone, had insisted on speaking to them before making any public announcement. It was typical of the man who had spent his entire life putting duty before personal comfort, yet who never forgot the importance of family bonds. Catherine reached for William's hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that had become second nature over their years together. She could feel the tension in his grip, the way his jaw tightened when he was processing difficult emotions. As someone who had married into this extraordinary family, she had learned to read these subtle signs, to understand the complex dance between public responsibility and private grief that defined royal life. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily, marking the minutes until the broadcast would begin. Each tick seemed to echo through the room, a countdown to a moment that would forever divide their lives into before and after. Before, when cancer was something that happened to other families, other people. After, when it became an unwelcome visitor in their own home, threatening the man who had guided them both through the complexities of royal duty and personal growth. Catherine thought about the children, about George, Charlotte, and Louis, who were at school, blissfully unaware of the announcement their grandfather was about to make to the world. How do you explain to children that the strong, vibrant man they knew as Grandpapa was facing a battle that even kings couldn't command to victory? How do you maintain the delicate balance between honesty and hope that parenting requires, especially when you're struggling to find that balance yourself? William's mind was traveling down similar paths, but his thoughts were also colored by memories of another time, another cancer diagnosis that had devastated his world. His mother's battle with the illness had been mercifully brief, but devastating in its impact on their family. The irony that he was now facing a similar situation with his father wasn't lost on him. Life, it seemed, had a cruel sense of symmetry sometimes. The couple had spent the early morning hours discussing practical matters with their private secretaries and senior staff. There would be changes to their schedule, additional security considerations, and the inevitable media attention that would follow the announcement. But beyond the logistical challenges lay the emotional reality that they were only beginning to process. This wasn't just about managing a crisis. It was about supporting the man they both loved and respected through what would likely be the greatest challenge of his life. Palace Protocol had specific procedures for situations like this, guidelines developed over decades of royal experience with public health announcements. But protocol couldn't address the human element, the raw emotion of watching someone you love face their mortality with the eyes of the world upon them. It couldn't provide a script for the conversations they would need to have with their children or the strength they would need to find to support each other through the coming months. Catherine's thoughts drifted to her own parents, to the conversations she had shared with them that morning. The Middleton family had always been a source of strength and normalcy in her life, providing a counterbalance to the extraordinary circumstances of royal existence. Their practical wisdom and unconditional support had helped her navigate the challenges of public life, and she knew she would need that foundation more than ever in the coming weeks. The princess also found herself thinking about the countless families across the Commonwealth and beyond who would hear this announcement and recognize their own experiences reflected in it. Cancer didn't discriminate based on title or position, and in many ways, the king's openness about his diagnosis would shine a light on a disease that touched millions of lives every year. There was something both heartbreaking and inspiring about the way personal tragedy could become a source of comfort and connection for others facing similar battles. William walked to the sideboard and poured himself a glass of water, his movements careful and controlled. He had learned long ago to mask his emotions in public, but here, in the privacy of their home, with only Catherine as witness, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of the situation. His relationship with his father had evolved significantly over the years, growing from the sometimes strained dynamic of his youth into a deep respect and genuine affection for the man who would be king. The prince reflected on the phone conversations they had shared in recent weeks, conversations that had taken on new significance in light of the morning's news. His father had spoken more openly than usual about his hopes for the monarchy, about the legacy he wanted to leave, about his love for his family. At the time, William had attributed this openness to the natural reflection that comes with age and responsibility. Now, he wondered if his father had already suspected what the doctors would eventually confirm. Catherine rejoined him at the sideboard, and together they stood in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but drawing comfort from the other's presence. Their marriage had been tested by many challenges over the years, from the intense scrutiny of their courtship to the pressures of raising children in the public eye. But through it all, they had developed a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine love that had only grown stronger with time. The Princess of Wales found herself thinking about the public appearances they would need to make in the coming days, the careful balance they would need to strike between maintaining royal dignity and allowing their humanity to show through. The British people, and indeed people around the world, would be looking to them for reassurance, for signs that the royal family remained strong and united in the face of adversity. But they would also be watching for authenticity, for genuine emotion that would make this very public family relatable in their time of private struggle. As the minutes continued to tick by, both William and Catherine found themselves preparing mentally for the moment when their private knowledge would become public reality. Once the announcement was made, there would be no going back to the relative simplicity of their previous concerns. Their lives, already lived largely in the public eye, would be subject to even greater scrutiny as the world watched to see how they would support the king through his treatment and recovery. The couple had already begun discussing the practical implications of the diagnosis with their staff and advisors. There would likely be changes to the king's schedule, which might mean additional responsibilities for them as senior working royals. They were prepared for that challenge, having spent years building their own platform of charitable work and public engagement. But the emotional aspect of supporting a loved one through cancer treatment was something no amount of royal training could fully prepare them for. William thought about his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, and how she had faced her own health challenges with such grace and dignity in her final years. The example she had set in balancing personal struggle with public duty provided a template of sorts, but he also recognized that each situation was unique, requiring its own approach and solutions. His father would need to find his own way through this challenge, just as his grandmother had found hers. The morning light continued to stream through the windows, gradually shifting as the sun moved higher in the sky. In a few hours, school would end, and they would need to collect their children and have conversations that no parent wants to have. They would need to find words to explain a situation that even adults struggle to understand, to provide comfort and reassurance while being honest about the uncertainty that lay ahead. Catherine's experience as a mother had taught her much about the delicate balance between protection and honesty that children require. George, as the eldest, would likely understand more of the implications than his younger siblings, but all three would need careful guidance through what promised to be a difficult period. The couple had already agreed that they would be the ones to tell the children, that this conversation was too important and too personal to delegate to others. The palace phone system had been unusually active that morning, as various members of the royal family coordinated their response to the announcement. Harry had been contacted despite the ongoing tensions within the family, because some moments transcend personal disagreements. Other members of the royal family were being briefed and prepared for the questions they would inevitably face from both media and the public in the coming days. As they waited, William and Catherine found themselves reflecting on the broader implications of the announcement beyond their immediate family circle. The king's cancer diagnosis would have political implications, constitutional considerations, and practical effects on the functioning of the monarchy. But underneath all of those important but secondary concerns lay the simple, human reality of a son worried about his father, a daughter-in-law concerned about a man she had come to love and respect, and grandchildren who would need help understanding why grandpapa might not be able to play with them as much as he used to. The couple had learned, through years of public service, that their personal experiences often became symbols for broader human experiences. Their wedding had represented hope and renewal for millions of people around the world. The birth of their children had sparked celebrations across the Commonwealth. Their charitable work had brought attention to causes that might otherwise have struggled for recognition. Now, their family's experience with cancer would likely become another chapter in their public story, one that could bring comfort and inspiration to others facing similar challenges. But for now, in these final minutes before the announcement, they allowed themselves to simply be a family facing an uncertain future together. The titles, the protocol, the public expectations, all of that would matter again soon enough. Right now, they were simply William and Catherine preparing to support the man they both called Papa through the greatest challenge of his life, while somehow finding the strength to continue their own work of service to others. Hashtag an emotional scene as William and Catherine listened to King Charles's cancer speech. Hashtag part 2. The familiar face of the BBC News presenter filled the screen, her expression carrying the gravity that had become all too common in recent years of global uncertainty. William reached for the remote control, his hand hovering over the volume button as if adjusting the sound might somehow change what they were about to hear. Catherine moved closer to him on the sofa, their shoulders touching in a gesture of mutual support that had sustained them through countless challenges over the years. The presenter's voice was clear and professional as she announced that they would now hear from His Majesty the King regarding a personal health matter. The words seemed to hang in the air, each syllable carrying weight that pressed down on the room like a physical force. This was the moment when their private family crisis would become public knowledge, shared with millions of people across Britain and around the world who looked to the royal family for stability and continuity. When King Charles appeared on screen, seated in his familiar study at Clarence House, both William and Catherine felt their breath catch slightly. Despite having spoken with him just hours earlier, seeing him in this formal setting, preparing to share such personal news with the world, drove home the magnitude of what was happening. The king looked composed and dignified, as he always did in public, but those who knew him well could detect the subtle signs of the strain he was under. His voice, when he began to speak, carried the same measured cadence that had characterized his public communications for decades. But there was something different in his tone, a vulnerability that made this announcement unlike any other he had given during his long years of public service. He spoke directly to the camera, as if addressing each viewer personally, explaining that routine medical tests had revealed the presence of cancer and that he had begun treatment immediately. Catherine found herself studying his face as he spoke, looking for signs of the man she had come to know as a caring father-in-law and devoted grandfather to her children. Behind the formal language of the announcement, she could see the person who had welcomed her into the royal family with warmth and kindness, who had guided her through the complexities of royal life with patience and understanding. The thought that this strong, vibrant man was facing such a serious illness seemed almost incomprehensible. William's reaction was more complex, colored by his unique position as both son and heir to the throne. He was watching his father deliver what might be one of the most important speeches of his reign, while simultaneously processing the reality that the man who had prepared him for kingship was now facing his own mortality. The weight of future responsibility, always present but typically manageable, suddenly felt more immediate and pressing. The king spoke about his gratitude for the medical team that had detected the cancer early, emphasizing the importance of regular health checks and early intervention. His words were carefully chosen to provide both honesty about his situation and reassurance about his prognosis. He mentioned that he looked forward to returning to his full schedule of royal duties as soon as his doctors advised it was appropriate, a statement that carried both hope and determination. As he continued, King Charles addressed the question that was undoubtedly on many minds regarding the continuity of the monarchy during his treatment. He expressed complete confidence in the Prince of Wales and other members of the royal family to carry out their duties and support the work of the crown during this period. For William, these words carried both honor and burden, representing a formal acknowledgement of the increased responsibilities he would need to shoulder in the coming months. Catherine watched her husband's reaction carefully, knowing how seriously he took any additional duty placed upon him by his father. She had witnessed his dedication to royal service over the years, his careful preparation for the role that awaited him, and his deep respect for the institution of the monarchy. But she also knew the personal cost of such dedication, the way it required constant balance between private desires and public obligations. The king's mention of his family brought a slight softening to his expression, a moment of genuine emotion that broke through the formal structure of the announcement. He spoke of their love and support with evident gratitude, and both William and Catherine felt the truth of those words deeply. The royal family, despite its public nature and formal protocols, was still fundamentally a family, bound by the same ties of affection and concern that connected families everywhere. When the king addressed the public directly, thanking them for their understanding and support, Catherine was struck by the genuine warmth in his voice. Throughout his years as Prince of Wales, and now as king, he had developed a deep connection with the British people, and that relationship would be more important than ever during his treatment and recovery. The outpouring of support that would undoubtedly follow his announcement would provide both practical help and emotional sustenance during the challenging months ahead. The technical aspects of the broadcast were flawless, as always with Royal Communications, but the human element was what made it so powerful. This wasn't just an institutional announcement about the health of the monarch. It was a father and grandfather sharing difficult news with an extended family that included millions of people who cared about him personally. The delicate balance between royal dignity and human vulnerability was perfectly struck, creating a moment of genuine connection that transcended the usual formality of royal communications. As the announcement continued, William found himself thinking about the conversations he would need to have with his children that evening. How do you explain to a young person that their grandfather, who seems strong and invincible to them, is facing a serious illness? How do you provide reassurance while being honest about the uncertainties that lay ahead? These were challenges that every family faces when dealing with cancer, but the public nature of their situation added layers of complexity that most people never have to navigate. Catherine's thoughts turned to the practical implications of the announcement for their immediate family life. There would be increased security considerations, changes to their public schedule, and, inevitably, intense media attention focused on every aspect of their response to the king's illness. She had learned over the years to manage such attention, but protecting her children from its more intrusive aspects would require careful planning and coordination with their security and communications teams. The king's emphasis on maintaining hope and positivity throughout his treatment resonated strongly with both William and Catherine. They had seen this approach work in other challenging situations the royal family had faced, and they understood the importance of projecting strength and resilience, not just for their own sake, but for the millions of people who look to them for leadership and inspiration. But they also recognized the emotional toll that such public strength could exact on private individuals dealing with fear and uncertainty. When King Charles mentioned his commitment to continuing his charitable work and public service as much as his health would allow, both William and Catherine felt a surge of pride and admiration. This dedication to duty, even in the face of personal adversity, exemplified the values that had been instilled in them both and that they were working to pass on to their own children. It was a powerful reminder of why they had chosen lives of public service, despite the personal sacrifices such service often required. The announcement's tone remained consistently hopeful throughout, emphasizing the positive aspects of early detection, modern treatment options, and the king's determination to overcome this challenge. This optimism wasn't just for public consumption. It reflected genuine beliefs about the power of positive thinking and strong support systems to aid in recovery from serious illness. For William and Catherine, this hopeful approach would become a framework for how they would discuss the situation with their children and support each other through the difficult days ahead. As the formal part of the announcement drew to a close, King Charles offered a final message of gratitude to the medical professionals who would be caring for him and to all those who worked in cancer treatment and research. This acknowledgement highlighted one of his long-standing interests in healthcare and medical research, causes that he had supported throughout his public life and that would now take on even greater personal significance. The broadcast concluded with the familiar ritual of royal communications, but the weight of what had just been shared hung in the air long after the television screen returned to regular programming. William and Catherine sat in silence for several minutes, each processing what they had just witnessed and beginning to absorb the reality of their changed circumstances. The man they both loved and respected had just shared his most vulnerable moment with the world, and their lives would never be quite the same. Catherine was the first to speak, her voice soft but steady as she expressed her admiration for the king's courage in making such a personal announcement. She had always respected his commitment to transparency and authenticity in his public communications, but this announcement took that commitment to an entirely new level. The decision to share his diagnosis publicly, while undoubtedly difficult personally, would undoubtedly help countless other families facing similar challenges feel less alone in their struggles. William's response was more complex, reflecting his dual role as son and future king. He expressed pride in his father's handling of the announcement while also beginning to articulate his own commitment to supporting both the king personally and the monarchy institutionally during this challenging period. The conversation that followed would set the tone for how they would approach the coming months as a family and as public figures representing the crown. The immediate aftermath of the broadcast brought a flurry of activity as phones began ringing with calls from other family members, government officials, and palace staff coordinating the response to the announcement. But beneath all the practical considerations and institutional requirements lay the simple human reality of a family coming together to support one of its members through a health crisis. In that respect, the royal family was no different from any other family facing the challenge of cancer, united by love and determined to face whatever came next together. Hashtag an emotional scene as William and Catherine listened to King Charles's cancer speech. Hashtag part 3. The silence that followed the end of the broadcast was profound, filled with the weight of unspoken thoughts and emotions that both William and Catherine were still processing. The familiar sounds of Kensington Palace seemed muted, as if the entire building was holding its breath, waiting to see how this moment would reshape their lives going forward. Even the staff, who were typically discreet but present, seemed to move with extra care through the corridors, understanding instinctively that this was a moment that demanded reverence and space. Catherine's phone was the first to break the quiet, vibrating gently with what would be the beginning of a flood of messages from family members, friends, and colleagues who had just witnessed the same broadcast. She glanced at the screen and saw her mother's name, along with those of her siblings and several close friends who knew to reach out during significant moments. But she made no move to answer just yet, understanding that she and William needed these few minutes to process their own reactions before they could effectively support others through theirs. William stood and walked to the window again, his gaze directed outward, but his focus clearly internal. The view from their private sitting room encompassed part of the palace gardens, and beyond that, the bustling streets of London, where millions of people were going about their daily lives, many of whom had just received the same news he and Catherine had been preparing for all morning. He found himself wondering how many of those people had their own experiences with cancer, how many would hear his father's words and think of their own battles or those of people they loved. The Prince of Wales had always understood, intellectually, that his family's private moments often became public property by virtue of their position. But there was something particularly poignant about this situation, where his father's health crisis would be shared, analyzed, and discussed by people around the world. While he appreciated the support and concern that such attention often brought, he also felt protective of his father's privacy and dignity during what was undoubtedly one of the most challenging periods of his life. Catherine joined him at the window, and together they watched as life continued to unfold outside their private space. She thought about all the families who were, at that very moment, dealing with their own cancer diagnoses in relative privacy, without the scrutiny and support that would inevitably surround the king's treatment. There was both privilege and burden in their public position, resources and attention that could help ensure the best possible care, but also an inability to grieve or worry in private that most families took for granted. Their conversation, when it finally began, was quiet and thoughtful, touching on practical matters, but also exploring the deeper implications of what they had just witnessed. William spoke about his admiration for his father's composure during the broadcast, while also acknowledging his own anxiety about the period of uncertainty that lay ahead. The medical team had been cautiously optimistic, but both he and Catherine understood that cancer treatment was unpredictable regardless of the resources and expertise available. The discussion naturally turned to their children and the conversation they would need to have that evening. George, at his age, would likely understand more about the seriousness of the diagnosis than his younger siblings, but all three would need careful explanation and ongoing support as they processed their grandfather's illness. Catherine had already spoken with their teachers and the school administration, ensuring that the children would have additional support available if needed during this period. The couple had learned, through their years of parenting in the public eye, that honesty balanced with age-appropriate explanation was usually the most effective approach with their children. They would explain that grandpapa was sick and would need special medicine to help him get better, that there might be times when he couldn't play as much as usual, and that the whole family would be working together to support him through his treatment. The conversation would undoubtedly be difficult, but they were committed to maintaining the open communication that had always characterized their family relationships. William's phone began buzzing with calls from senior palace staff, government officials, and other members of the royal family, all seeking coordination and clarification about the implications of the king's announcement. As heir to the throne, he would be expected to take on additional responsibilities during his father's treatment, and the logistics of such arrangements required careful planning and communication. But he found himself reluctant to engage with these practical considerations just yet, wanting to preserve these moments of private processing before returning to his public role. Catherine watched her husband navigate these competing demands, recognizing the tension between his desire to support his father as a son and his obligation to serve the institution of the monarchy as heir. She had witnessed this balancing act many times over the years, but it had never felt more acute than it did in this moment. Her own role would be equally complex, supporting both her husband and the king while maintaining her own public commitments and protecting their children from the more difficult aspects of the situation. The Princess of Wales found herself thinking about the other members of the royal family and how they would be processing this news. Princess, and with her no-nonsense approach and deep commitment to duty, would likely be one of the king's strongest sources of support during his treatment. Prince Edward and Sophie would undoubtedly step up their public engagements to help fill any gaps in the royal schedule. Even Prince Andrew, despite his reduced public role, would likely want to support his brother during this challenging time. The question of Prince Harry's response to the announcement was more complex, given the ongoing tensions within the family. While personal disagreements might have created distance between the brothers, Catherine hoped that this health crisis might provide an opportunity for healing and reconciliation. Cancer had a way of putting other conflicts into perspective, and she knew that William would welcome any gesture of support from his brother during this difficult period. William's thoughts were indeed turning toward Harry, remembering their shared experience of losing their mother and how that tragedy had initially brought them closer together before other factors drove them apart. He found himself hoping that their father's illness might serve as a bridge back toward the relationship they had once shared, but he was also realistic about the complexity of family dynamics and the challenges that had created their current situation. The couple's conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door, followed by the entrance of their private secretary with updates about the immediate response to the king's announcement. The initial public reaction had been overwhelmingly supportive, with messages of concern and well wishes flooding in from around the world. Social media was filled with expressions of support and shared personal stories from people who had been touched by cancer in their own lives. The response, while gratifying, also underscored the magnitude of attention that would surround every aspect of the king's treatment and recovery. Catherine listened to these updates while thinking about the careful balance they would need to maintain between sharing enough information to satisfy public interest and preserving the king's privacy and dignity during his treatment. The royal family had learned, through various challenges over the years, that transparency and authenticity generally serve them better than secrecy and distance, but medical situations required especially delicate handling. The discussion with their private secretary also touched on practical adjustments to their upcoming schedule of engagements. Some events would likely be postponed or reassigned, while others would take on additional significance as opportunities to demonstrate the continuity and stability of the monarchy during this period. William and Catherine had always taken their public duties seriously, but they understood that their role would be even more important in the coming months as they provided reassurance and leadership for the institution they represented. After their private secretary left, the couple found themselves alone again with their thoughts and emotions. Catherine moved to the small kitchen area of their private quarters and began preparing tea, a simple domestic routine that provided both comfort and normalcy in the midst of extraordinary circumstances. The familiar actions of warming the pot and measuring the tea leaves felt grounding, connecting her to the millions of people around the world who turn to similar small rituals during times of stress and uncertainty. William accepted the cup she offered him gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warm porcelain as if drawing strength from its heat. Their conversation resumed, touching on memories of happier times with the king, his joy in his role as grandfather, and his passion for the causes and issues that had defined his public life. These reflections helped them focus on the positive aspects of their relationship with him and the hope for many more years of such experiences. The Prince of Wales spoke about his father's remarkable energy and enthusiasm for his work, qualities that he believed would serve him well during his treatment and recovery. King Charles had always approached challenges with determination and optimism, traits that had enabled him to navigate the complexities of his role and to find meaning and purpose in his public service. These same qualities would undoubtedly be crucial in his battle against cancer. Catherine shared her own observations about the king's character, particularly his kindness and thoughtfulness in his personal relationships. She spoke about the way he had welcomed her into the family, his genuine interest in her background and experiences, and his obvious delight in his grandchildren. These personal qualities, she believed, would inspire the kind of support and prayer from people around the world that often proved crucial in medical recovery. Their conversation was interrupted again, this time by the sound of car doors closing outside, indicating that the children were returning from school. William and Catherine exchanged a look, recognizing that their private processing time was coming to an end, and that they would now need to shift into their roles as parents navigating their children through a difficult situation. The conversation they had been preparing for all day was about to begin, and they both felt the weight of responsibility that came with being the primary source of comfort and explanation for their 3 young children. George entered first, his school bag slung over his shoulder, and his expression curious but not yet concerned. Charlotte and Louis followed, their usual after-school energy temporarily subdued by the unusual atmosphere they could sense in the house. The children had learned to read the subtle signs of stress or significance in their parents' behavior, and they clearly recognized that something important was happening. William knelt down to George's level, while Catherine gathered Charlotte and Louis close to her. The conversation that followed would be one of the most important they had ever had as parents, requiring them to balance honesty with reassurance, explanation with comfort. They spoke simply and directly about their grandfather's illness, answering the children's questions with patience and care, and emphasizing the love and support that would surround Grandpapa during his treatment. The children's reactions varied according to their ages and personalities, but all 3 showed the resilience and maturity that their parents had worked hard to develop in them. George asked thoughtful questions about the treatment process, while Charlotte seemed more concerned about whether Grandpapa would still be able to attend her upcoming school events. Louis, the youngest, was primarily interested in whether his grandfather would still be able to play their favorite games together. Hashtag an emotional scene as William and Catherine listened to King Charles's cancer speech hashtag part 4 as evening settled over Kensington Palace. The family gathered in their private dining room for what had become an unexpectedly meaningful meal together. The children, having processed the news about their grandfather's illness with the remarkable adaptability that young people often display, had gradually returned to their normal routines while maintaining an underlying current of extra gentleness and consideration. Their questions continued throughout the evening, each one providing William and Catherine with opportunities to reinforce messages of hope, family unity, and the importance of supporting loved ones through difficult times. Catherine observed her children carefully throughout the meal, noting the small ways they were processing the day's revelations. George seemed more subdued than usual, occasionally asking mature questions about medical treatment and recovery that revealed his growing understanding of the seriousness of the situation. Charlotte alternated between her usual spirited conversation and moments of quiet reflection, while Louis appeared largely unchanged, except for occasional comments about wanting to draw pictures for Grandpapa to help him feel better. The evening routine proceeded with careful normalcy, William helping with homework while Catherine supervised bath time and bedtime preparations. Both parents were conscious of maintaining the stability and predictability that children need, especially during periods of uncertainty and change. The familiar rhythms of family life provided comfort not just for the children, but for William and Catherine themselves, grounding them in their most fundamental roles as parents even as they prepared for the challenging months ahead. After the children were settled for the night, William and Catherine returned to their private sitting room, where the events of the day seemed to settle around them like a heavy cloak. The gravity of their new reality was becoming clearer as the immediate shock of the morning's announcement gave way to longer-term considerations about how their lives would need to adapt to support the king through his treatment, while maintaining their own family's well-being and public obligations. Catherine's phone had been filled with messages throughout the day, from family members expressing their support and concern, from friends offering practical help and emotional sustenance, and from various organizations and individuals within their professional network adjusting schedules and commitments in response to the king's announcement. The outpouring of support was both heartening and overwhelming, a reminder of how many people's lives were touched by the royal family's personal experiences. William had spent much of the evening in conversation with senior palace officials, coordinating the practical response to his father's diagnosis and beginning to plan for the increased responsibilities he would need to assume. The constitutional implications of the king's illness, while not immediately critical given the early-stage nature of the diagnosis and the expected positive prognosis, still required careful consideration and preparation. The machinery of monarchy needed to continue functioning smoothly regardless of personal circumstances, and William felt the weight of that responsibility acutely. The couple found themselves discussing the broader implications of the day's events for their understanding of their roles and responsibilities. Catherine spoke about her growing appreciation for the fragility of life and the importance of making the most of every opportunity to serve others and support their family. The announcement had served as a powerful reminder that none of them could take their time together for granted, and that the work they were doing in their public roles took on additional meaning when viewed through the lens of life's uncertainties. William expressed similar sentiments about the day's impact on his perspective, particularly regarding his relationship with his father and his understanding of the burden of kingship. Watching the king deliver such a personal announcement with dignity and composure had reinforced his admiration for his father's character, while also highlighting the personal costs that came with royal service. The thought that he might need to assume greater responsibilities sooner than originally planned was both daunting and motivating. Their conversation naturally turned to the practical adjustments they would need to make in the coming weeks and months. Catherine's charitable work would likely need to expand to cover some of the areas where the king's reduced schedule might create gaps. William's duties as Prince of Wales would become even more significant as he represented the crown at events and meetings that his father might not be able to attend. Both of them understood that this period would test their ability to balance increased public service with their commitment to their family's private needs. The Princess of Wales found herself thinking about the other royal spouses and family members who would be navigating similar challenges. Queen Camilla's support for the king would be crucial during his treatment, and Catherine felt a deep admiration for the grace and strength that the queen consort would undoubtedly display during this difficult period. The bonds between the royal women had strengthened over the years, based on shared understanding of the unique challenges their positions presented, and Catherine knew that mutual support would be more important than ever. The discussion also touched on the public's response to the announcement and the opportunities it might create for positive impact beyond their immediate family circle. The king's openness about his diagnosis would undoubtedly encourage others to seek medical attention for concerning symptoms, potentially saving lives through early detection and treatment. His visibility during treatment would also help reduce stigma around cancer and demonstrate that the disease, while serious, was not incompatible with continued purpose and contribution. William reflected on the messages of support that had already begun arriving from around the Commonwealth and beyond, expressions of concern and affection that demonstrated the deep personal connection many people felt with his father. These responses reminded him of the unique position the monarchy held in people's lives, serving not just as a constitutional institution, but as a source of continuity, stability, and shared identity that transcended political differences and geographical boundaries. As the evening progressed, both William and Catherine found themselves thinking about the example they wanted to set for their children during this challenging time. They hoped to demonstrate that difficult circumstances could be faced with courage, dignity, and mutual support, that family bonds could provide strength during times of crisis, and that public service remained meaningful and important even when personal challenges arose. These lessons, they believed, would serve their children well regardless of the paths their lives might take. The couple also discussed the importance of maintaining hope and optimism throughout the king's treatment, not just for public consumption, but for their own family's emotional well-being. While they were realistic about the challenges that lay ahead, they were also committed to focusing on positive outcomes and the many reasons for confidence in the king's recovery. The medical team was excellent, the diagnosis had been made early, and the king's overall health and determination were strong foundations for successful treatment. Catherine spoke about her plans to increase her involvement with cancer-related charities and research organizations, seeing this as an opportunity to channel her personal experience into meaningful public service. Her position would allow her to bring attention and resources to important work in cancer prevention, treatment, and support for families affected by the disease. This sense of purpose and direction helped provide a framework for thinking about the positive outcomes that might emerge from their family's challenging experience. William expressed similar thoughts about using this period to deepen his understanding of healthcare issues and to strengthen his support for medical research and innovation. His father had always been passionate about complementary medicine and holistic approaches to health and well-being, perspectives that would now take on additional personal significance. The experience might also provide opportunities to explore new ways of serving the public through health-related initiatives and partnerships. Their conversation was punctuated by moments of silence, comfortable pauses that allowed them to process the emotional weight of the day while drawing strength from each other's presence. These quiet interludes reminded them of the fundamental partnership that had sustained them through previous challenges and would continue to support them through whatever lay ahead. Their marriage had been tested by many pressures over the years, but it had consistently proven resilient and strengthening under adversity. As the night deepened, they began to discuss practical preparations for the following day, which would bring new challenges and opportunities to demonstrate their family's unity and strength. There would be public appearances to consider, messages to craft, and ongoing coordination with medical teams, palace staff, and government officials. But underneath all of these institutional requirements lay their personal commitment to supporting the king as a beloved family member facing a health crisis. The conversation gradually wound down as exhaustion from the emotional intensity of the day began to take its toll. Both William and Catherine felt the need for rest and renewal before facing the challenges that tomorrow would bring. They had navigated this first, crucial day with grace and dignity, supporting each other and their children while beginning to prepare for the longer journey that lay ahead. Before retiring for the night, they took a final moment to check on their sleeping children, each parent drawing comfort from the peaceful sight of George, Charlotte, and Louis resting securely in their beds. These quiet moments of parental love and protection felt especially precious in light of the day's events, reminders of what was most important and most worth protecting in their lives. The day that had begun with such anxiety and uncertainty was ending with a sense of determination and purpose. William and Catherine had faced their first major test since the king's diagnosis, and they had done so with the strength, unity, and commitment to service that would characterize their approach to the challenging months ahead. Their love for the king, their dedication to their family, and their commitment to their public roles would guide them through whatever difficulties and opportunities the future might hold. As they prepared for sleep, both felt grateful for the support system that surrounded them and confident in their ability to face the future together. The announcement had marked the end of one chapter in their family's story and the beginning of another, one that would test their resilience, but also provide opportunities for growth, service, and deeper appreciation for the precious gift of time spent with those they loved most. The journey ahead would not be easy, but they would face it together, sustained by love, hope, and an unshakable commitment to each other and to the people they served.